Recording of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Aladdin Classics edition, with a foreword by Newbery honor author Nancy Bond. Foreword. Let me tell you a story. Many years ago, before any of us was born, there were 3 sisters. Their names were Frances, Edith, and Edwina, and they lived with their widowed mother in a shabby little house in the backwoods of Tennessee. Originally, the Hodgsons came from England. In 1856, they had sailed to the United States to seek their fortune, but alas, they hadn't found it. Times were hard. The Civil War had just ended, and it was not easy to find work. The Hodgsons were poor. There was never enough money to buy new clothes when the old ones wore out or got too short and tight across the shoulders. They never traveled or went to concerts or plays. Sometimes there wasn't much to eat and no fire on the hearth to keep them warm. Now and then, one of their neighbors would pass on to them an old magazine, and the sisters would pore over it, admiring the ladies' fine fashions and reading the stories again and again. All 3 of them loved stories. Best of all, Edith and Edwina loved to hear Frances tell them the stories she could make up out of her own head. If they couldn't wear beautiful gowns or be invited to balls and dance all night with handsome young men, if they couldn't hold tea parties for other young ladies under the arbor in a splendid garden blooming with roses, hollyhocks, foxgloves, and lilies, Frances could transport them out of their dull, everyday poverty to a place where they could pretend, at least for a little while, that they were ladies of leisure, courted by wealthy and admiring suitors in a sunny daydream world. Frances's stories made their lives bearable. Frances was a born storyteller. Almost from the time she could talk, she knew how to spin stories out of the people she observed around her and her own imagination. And the stories she invented were so good, so full of adventure and romance and interesting, glamorous characters, that her sisters were enthralled. At the end of each episode, they begged her to go on. "But what happens next?" they'd cry, and Frances would oblige them by telling. Edith thought her sister's stories were even better than the ones they read over and over in Godey's Lady's Book. She urged Frances to try selling one, but the Hodgsons had so little money they couldn't even afford the clean paper that Frances needed to write on, or the envelope and stamps to mail it to a magazine. Then Edwina, who was the youngest, had an idea. Why not take pails out into the woods and pick wild grapes to sell? And that's what they did. Frances copied out Miss Carruthers' engagement in her best handwriting, careful to use only one side of each sheet, and swearing her sister's secrecy, she sent it out into the world. She was 17 years old, and although she didn't know it, she was embarking on a lifelong career. "If you tell stories, you like nothing so much as to tell them to people who want to listen," says Sarah Crewe in the book you're about to read. More than 30 years after she copied out that first story, Frances Hodgson Burnett was still telling stories to people who wanted to listen. By 1905, when she wrote A Little Princess, her audience had grown very large indeed and included an American president and a British prime minister. She had married Dr. Swan Burnett, was the mother of 2 boys, and no longer lived in the backwoods of Tennessee. She had become one of the most popular and successful authors of her day. At a time when most women did not support themselves, she was earning enough money from her writing for all the things she and her sisters had dreamed of when they were young: a comfortable house in Washington, D.C., fine clothes, plenty of books, and trips to England and Italy. Of all the many stories and novels Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote, however, only 2 are still wildly read and loved today: The Secret Garden and A Little Princess. Actually, she wrote A Little Princess twice. The first time she called it Sarah Crewe, or What Happened at Miss Minchin's, and it was much shorter than it is now. Some time later, after she had turned it into a play, she explained, "I discovered 3 acts full of things. What interested me the most was that I found that there had been girls at the school whose names I had never known before. There was a girl named Lottie. There was a hungry, scurly maid. Ermengarde was much more entertaining than she had seemed at first. Things happened in the garret which had never been hinted at in the book, and a certain gentleman, whose name was Melchizedek, was an intimate friend of Sarah's, who never should have been left out of the story if he had only walked into it in time. I haven't read that earlier version. I simply can't imagine Miss Minchin's school without those characters and the richness they bring to Sarah's story. They are an essential part of the magic of a little princess. Spoiled little Lottie, the youngest boarder, is only 4 when Sarah meets her. And when she wanted anything, or did not want anything, she wept and howled, and, as she always wanted the things she could not have, and did not want the things that were best for her, her shrill little voice was usually to be heard uplifted in wails. She causes timid, flustery Miss Amelia to wring her hands in despair. Is there anyone who can control the child? And poor Becky, the orphan scurly maid, who lives in the cold, bare attic, and never has enough to eat, and falls asleep one chilly afternoon where she shouldn't have been. How could Sarah possibly do without Becky? As for Ermengarde, plump, awkward Ermengarde, who is considered the monumental dunce of the school, because she is slow and can never remember her French lessons, who would guess she'd turn into such a loyal friend? Melchizedek, well, I don't think I'll tell you anything about Melchizedek. You need to find out about him for yourself. When you do, I think you will agree. Thank goodness he appeared in time. When 7-year-old Sarah Crewe first arrives in London and opens the door of Miss Minchin's select seminary for young ladies, we find all these characters and more waiting inside. A whole crowd of people who will remain vivid in our memories long after we've read the last sentence of the last chapter. The story begins like a fairy tale. Once on a dark winter's day, when the yellow fog hung so thick and heavy in the streets of London that the lamps were lighted and the shop windows blazed with gas, as they do at night, an odd-looking girl sat in a cab with her father and was driven rather slowly through the big thoroughfares. It's the 19th century. Victoria is Queen of England, and the cab the little girl is riding in is being pulled by a horse. Her beloved papa, Captain Crewe, is bringing her to what he has been assured is an excellent boarding school. As well as being young and handsome, he has a lot of money, enough to provide Sarah, for, of course, this is our heroine, with every luxury she could possibly desire. Trunks full of elegant clothes, lots of books, a marvelous doll called Emily to keep her company, even a French maid. With the utmost confidence, he delivers her into the care and protection of Miss Minchin, and then he returns to India. Miss Minchin, she's another memorable character. She will have an enormous effect on Sarah's life, though not perhaps the one Captain Crewe supposes. She was very like her house, tall and dull, unrespectable and ugly. She had large, cold, fishy eyes, and a large, cold, fishy smile. It spread itself into a very large smile when she saw Sarah and Captain Crewe. Among other things, she had heard that he was a rich father who was willing to spend a great deal of money on his little daughter. While Miss Minchin seems entirely respectable, she doesn't sound like a very sympathetic person, does she? Even her name sounds pinched and cold. Or is it just Sarah's imagination? Like Frances Hodgson Burnett, Sarah has an exceptionally good imagination. And she is such a wonderful storyteller that she can hold her audience spellbound with her tales. If she had to, she would be able to transform a bare, shabby attic into a sumptuous sitting room, full of fine furnishings, and, to believe, in spite of ragged clothes, a cold hearth, and an empty stomach, that she is a princess. She's so good at imagining, she can almost make these things seem real. When I was 10 or 11, I joined Frances Hodgson Burnett's audience. I discovered The Secret Garden, and I read it over and over. The story of a plain, disagreeable Mary Lennox, sent from India to live in her uncle's mysterious house on the Yorkshire moors. But somehow I missed a little princess. I've had to wait until I'd grown up to read Sarah Crewe's story. Now that I have at last, I know I would have loved it every bit as much as The Secret Garden. I envy you as you stand on the doorstep of that big, dull brick house in London. about to find out for the first time what happened at Miss Minchin's. Go on, open the door and see. Foreword by Nancy Bond.